Good morning, everyone. I'm Kate Viar of Amazon. I'm a new member on the Internet Education Foundation, and it's my pleasure to introduce our next speakers for our next conversation. We have joining us now the House Judiciary Chairman and Chairman of the Congressional Internet Caucus, Bob Goodlatte, and he is joined by Fred Ehrsam of Coinbase, a co-founder of Coinbase.
Well, thanks very much. This is something that I really enjoy doing every year. We've had some great industry leaders come to talk to us about new technology. 2 years ago, we had Travis from Uber, and boy, that doesn't seem new anymore at all, does it? Just 2 years ago. And last year we had Dropbox, and now we have another great industry to talk about, and a great company and a great leader, and that's Fred Ehrsam. Fred is the co-founder and president of Coinbase, and he comes to that business from the financial services industry, where he was a foreign exchange trader at Goldman Sachs in New York, where he manually traded and managed Goldman's electronic market-making platform. He's also analyzed portfolios at BlackRock, the largest asset manager in the world, and worked in nanostructures research. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Computer Science and Economics with honors and distinction from Duke University. And he's taken that experience in the financial services world and translated into the tech world in a whole new form of currency. I'm just absolutely delighted that you're here. So Fred, tell us a little bit more about yourself, and welcome.
Thank you. And yeah, to be clear, I see myself as a good guy because I'm a technologist first. So as the intro said, I'm one of the two guys that runs Coinbase, which is the largest Bitcoin company in the world at the moment. I think we see this as a very important innovation. Frankly, one that is a little bit challenging to understand, I think, if you're not a pure technologist, because it's probably most analogous to the internet. It's a very, very low-level protocol innovation that has a lot of broad implications. And we probably, just like the internet, won't see a lot of them for a number of years, which is why, frankly, I'm out here to try to get your minds kind of spinning around it.
So Coinbase, the world's leading Bitcoin company. Tell them in the amount of time it took us to go up in the elevator, what you would want them to tell somebody when they said, "Oh yeah, I heard Fred Ehrsam from Coinbase, and he does
X."
Yeah.
Yeah. So
what would they tell their friends they're going to use Coinbase for?
I think so. The simple way to think about Coinbase is it's kind of like PayPal, but Bitcoin is the underlier rather than dollars or euros or a fiat currency. I think more broadly, the way to think about Bitcoin is kind of doing for transactions what the internet did for information dissemination and distribution. It's making everything an order of magnitude cheaper, faster, and arguably most importantly, it's making everything open so that everybody can access it. Anybody can go and build on it, right? That's kind of why we saw this massive wave of innovation with the internet, is this kind of concept of permissionless innovation. We basically see Bitcoin as the fundamental infrastructure that'll do that for transactions.
And you've got some pretty interesting believers too. Last week you announced the close of your latest round of capital acquisition for your company, and included some pretty impressive financial institutions, including the New York Stock Exchange and USAA Bank. What do these institutions see as the promise of Coinbase and Bitcoins in general?
I think they're looking at it in that same way. When the internet came along, you had a lot of companies that ended up being disrupted or had their businesses drastically changed by what the internet allowed. A good example would be the New York Times in 1994. Obviously, their business looks a lot different now, and they probably would have been served well if they had kind of dipped their toe in the water earlier. rather than like a lot of companies been scrambling in the late 90s saying, oh, what's our internet strategy? So I think what you're seeing here is more forward-thinking people in financial services taking a look at this, seeing a similar movie having played out before, and really thinking, how do we get some institutional knowledge around this? Because we know it's going to change our business somehow. We might not know exactly how right now, but we'd be well served to have a good level of understanding around it.
And yesterday you announced the launch of the first US-based Bitcoin exchange. I think you're up and operating in 23 states already. Can you tell us a bit more about that launch, and what does that mean for the average American consumer and or merchant to have a transparent and US regulated exchange like that?
Yeah, I think it's really important. So for some context here, a lot of the Bitcoin companies or exchanges have been largely operating outside of the United States. A lot of it is really for regulatory scrutiny reasons to this point in time. But we did launch the first US exchange with some capital from the New York Stock Exchange on Monday. I think this is really important because it really lays groundwork and infrastructure that's necessary for other great companies and ideas to be built on top of Bitcoin. It's not a perfect analogy, but you might view this as something like AOL in the early days, where by allowing a reasonable exchange from dollars to Bitcoin, you're kind of enabling other parts of the technology, almost like AOL allowed a bunch of people to dial up to the internet and at least kind of get started, get involved. It's a foundation that needed to be there.
A lot of people have heard of of Bitcoins, and some people. I'm a customer of Coinbase. I have
Glad to hear it.
A wallet with your company, but a lot of people have heard of it but have never used it. And I would imagine that that's one of the impediments to growth in the industry. Talk about some of the challenges that this industry faces that you have to deal with.
Sure. So part of it is simply a time thing. So again, thinking about the internet, it took many, many years for us to get from the first web browser in 93, kind of 94 timeframe, to a place now where we all depend on the internet for a lot of basic parts of our daily lives, right? Fast forwarding, 23 years now? So I think there's a similar kind of technological innovation wave that's happening here, hopefully over a shorter period of time, where we're kind of in Bitcoin where the internet was in 93, 94. That's a part of it.
People are trying to figure out how it works for them, why it's important for them, what use they're going to have of it.
That's right.
They haven't figured that out yet.
That's right. I mean, eBay didn't exist right when the internet came out, for example. Neither did Google Maps. So a lot of this stuff just takes time to create. Part of it, too, is regulatory understanding and understanding from necessary kind of incumbents. So, for example, it's very difficult to get banked as a Bitcoin company right now. So if you're trying to start, a business around Bitcoin, that's just one more hurdle that you need to cross. So hopefully, as people become better educated over time, those kind of hurdles just get lowered and lowered and lowered, such that more and more great ideas can get built.
And how have your conversations been going on right here in Washington, which is the heart of that bureaucracy that you have to deal with both here and in the States and internationally? But right here is an important place to have those conversations. How's that going?
It's to be honest, it's pretty varied, and I think it's varied mostly because of education level at this point. I think people who understand it are extremely excited about it and are generally supportive. There are times where people are less educated, and that could be a little threatening, or they might read slightly more sensationalist media headlines around it. This might you might view that as the equivalent to like child porn or illegal file sharing in the early days of the internet, where it seemed very scary because it's a powerful new technology. But again, at the end of the day, it really does much more good than harm, I think.
And different countries and different states are taking different approaches to this too, aren't they? Some of them are viewing this as a good thing. They want to promote it. They want to be a part of it. Some of them are concerned about it for a variety of reasons. Mm-hmm. Some of them want to treat it as a currency. Some want to treat it as an investment. Is that good that we have that kind of competition of ideas about what the place of Bitcoin is in terms of the governments you have to deal with, or is it just making the problem even more difficult to solve?
So I think it's good in the sense that you have some geographies, and specifically states here, where they see the promise of the technology and they're trying to be supportive of it, because that keeps others honest in really having to go and understand what they're regulating. There is some bad potentially in this, because I think people are thinking about this almost a little bit too much from a financial services first perspective, where you get people trying to fit old laws to Bitcoin, where you really get a kind of a round peg, square hole problem. For example, money transmission laws, and this is at the state level. This is what a Western Union, for example, would be regulated as. Those are kind of being applied to Bitcoin right now, and these are laws that were conceived of to regulate literally a physical exchange of cash, not conceived of for the kind of the internet age of how all of this has evolved. And just like the internet, it's an entirely new paradigm where almost by definition, the laws that exist don't fit perfectly. So I think the biggest thing that I'm concerned about is regulators and lawmakers really being thoughtful about why fundamentally this distributed system is different than what's existed before, and how that may in some cases mean that existing things don't really fit so well.
And some have criticized digital currency in general, or been suspicious of it as a mechanism for money laundering or other crimes. Frankly, that's true of suitcases full of $100 bills as well. But tell us some of the responses you have to those criticisms, and why Bitcoin can actually help in certain areas.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a good way to think about this that people could relate to is, it's much like the early days of email, where you had law enforcement and regulators very scared because it seemed that all of a sudden anybody in the world, let's say a terrorist, could instantly send a message from one place in the world to another. That's a very scary proposition the first time you hear it. But fast forward to today, and we all depend on email for our daily lives, and in fact, I believe law enforcement actually likes email more than they dislike it, because it creates some kind of trail. The same thing can be said for a cash transfer, right? Bitcoin, I think oftentimes there's this large misnomer where Bitcoin is seen as anonymous, which almost couldn't be further from the truth. Bitcoin is the most transparent transaction network that's ever existed, because fundamentally for Bitcoin to work, there's a large shared ledger, this thing you might have heard of called the blockchain, where every single transaction that has ever occurred on the network is publicly recorded. It's admittedly at times kind of like IP addresses. It's difficult to resolve exactly who's on one end and who's on the other. But
it doesn't give all the information about the transaction. Just shows that a transaction occurred.
That's exactly right. So it's, at the end of the day, it is all traced. I think one area the U.S. actually really led the way on here was FinCEN, the money laundering kind of division of the Treasury, came out very early in March of 2013 and set forth basic guidelines around how you need to run a Bitcoin business. Specifically, you need to run it just like you'd run a business with dollars. If you're moving money, you need to be responsible about who's putting money in and taking money out. So again, early days of any technology, this stuff might seem a little scary, but there are pretty good guardrails in place already, and I think this is going to be one of these things where over time it actually becomes a more powerful medium than it is scary.
And there are a lot of people here in the audience who are pretty new to Bitcoins in general, or Coinbase in particular. What's the best way for them to learn more?
I think the highest thing I would recommend is just try to use it. I think learning by doing is usually the best thing. So if you have a friend who has some, have them send you a fraction of a Bitcoin, try to go spend it. You can go spend it at a bunch of online retailers right now. So
tick off some of the major ones that are now taking Bitcoin.
Yeah, so Overstock.com is the first major one to accept it through us. Expedia, if you want to go plan a trip, you can go spend it there. Dell.com accepts it. Microsoft, it's really kind of mounting. The rough timeline on this is, in 2013, there were 0 really large merchants who were accepting Bitcoin, and fast forward to today, and there's somewhere around 15 businesses that are more than $1 billion in annual revenue who are. So it's spreading quickly. So I'd advise, go try it out. and I'm admittedly a little bit biased on this one because he's one of our investors, but Mark Andreessen wrote a great piece in the New York Times called Why Bitcoin Matters, which I think is probably the single best condensed piece on why Bitcoin is going to be an important trend.
If we have time for questions, that's where you can start finding out right now. So, who's got a question for us?
It's got to be somebody.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
From an economic perspective, I say, forget the delta, if I'm just looking at volatility of Bitcoin. How can we expect this to be an important part of a currency if it has a volatility well above any other major currency in the world? And how do we build institutions that can accomplish that can accommodate that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say a couple of things. One, we're in really early days in Bitcoin where speculation really outweighs a lot of practical use at the moment, and we think that will change as time goes on. So that, by definition, kind of reduces volatility. The other thing I would say is that if you just look at foreign exchange markets, you have similar problems, admittedly smaller, with volatility. And what's happened over time is, as markets have gotten more mature, you've had things like derivatives built on top of the currency, which allow you to hedge out risk exposure. So I would say in 3 to 4 years, we could reasonably get to an endpoint where businesses offer a solution where Bitcoin is simply a more efficient transactional rail, and the actual foreign exchange risk is hedged out for you as a service.
So as use of Bitcoins grows, the speculation will become a lesser part of it, and the currency will stabilize. I don't think it fluctuates now as much as it did 2 years ago, and I would expect that trend would continue on in the future. Tell us, the folks, a little bit more about Coinbase in terms of the number of customers you have or the number of merchants that you deal with, to give them a perspective on how this has grown already.
Sure. I mentioned a little bit on the merchant front earlier. On the customer front, so keep in mind we started this business about 2.5 years ago. We've got a little over 2 million wallet holders today, and it's a pretty US-centric business at the moment. Estimates for Bitcoin wallets around the world are around 10, 15 million. But it's growing pretty fast. Anywhere between $50 and $500 million are transacted on the Bitcoin network every day, which is something that's growing at a pretty reasonable clip. Again, I think it's much like the internet, where when people understand the technology, they start to harness it. Classic network effect, where this, I think, will likely creep up on people faster than they might expect.
Yes, sir.
I was wondering if you have an idea of how it might be used in a governance process, for example, in voting and decision-making and things of that sort.
Sure. So this is getting into a lot of the other applications of the blockchain, this kind of shared ledger that can prove a lot of different things. For example, a voting system, as this gentleman suggested. This is why you hear many technologists talking about Bitcoin as an innovation that goes far beyond financial services. You could, for example, build a voting system on top of Bitcoin where everybody is in control of their singular vote. It's auditable by anybody. You could issue, for example, even tickets to a concert on this, which now become freely transferable. You could even bake in rules as to exactly how these transactions have to occur. So I think the important underlying point here is that this goes far beyond what one might think of in the early days as I'm sending you some dollar value to I'm representing that I own a car deed or a house deed or I voted for this candidate on top of this secure network that can prove who's really done what.
Way in the back. Yes, sir.
Thank you. My question is there anything you need from Congress or Washington, D.C., like your highest priority for them to do, or do you just need D.C. policymakers to sort of step aside?
Two major things come to mind on that front. I think one huge victory for the internet in its really formative years was in 1997, the Clinton administration put out a very simple kind of guideline document on their view on the internet and how they wanted they wanted it to evolve, well, not it to evolve, but how they might view law and regulation around it. Very simple document that outlaid, I believe, 5 bullet points, each no longer than 3 sentences, with things like, we'll try to come up with a uniform state tax policy as to how sales tax is applied, for example. Or in general, we'd like to take a light touch as it evolves, and then as we better understand the technology, we'll go in and maybe establish more firm laws. Something like that, where it takes uncertainty out of the ecosystem for entrepreneurs who are trying to build on top of it, and similarly banks who might want to bank these companies, because frankly that's a huge challenge. If I were to ask for anything else, it would be that people like the OCC, for example, who are ultimately kind of the ones regulating these major banks, do as much as they can to really understand the technology and enable upstanding companies that are trying to build these great ideas in the space to do so, assuming they're following the kind of guardrails set forth by Treasury last year.
So your number one wish from government is really what most people in the tech sector want, and that is that government, including the Congress, understand the technology before they regulate it.
That's exactly right, and I think that this stuff always gets a little dangerous if you're building a singular company, but when it's an entire protocol where there are many years of innovation that are difficult to predict, I think that only becomes more and more important.
Absolutely, and as with everything else with the internet, the light touch is what has allowed it to grow and blossom. That's not to say that there isn't the opportunity to misuse any of the technology that we all deal with in the tech sector, but and therefore government needs to be paying attention to what's going on and doing the right thing to protect the people who are trying to grow the internet and create a vibrant new economy. But at the same time, they can snuff it out if they try to regulate something they don't understand.
That's right, and I think frankly the question about voting kind of gets to exactly that, where most people haven't even conceived of a lot of these things, and that very well may not exist if you just apply pure financial regulation to it, for example.
Yes, sir.
Hi. What kind of cost efficiencies does payment with Bitcoin offer versus more traditional payment networks?
Yeah, this is kind of being realized as we speak, but financial services tend to be closed networks. Not everybody can go and join the ACH network or the FedWire network. Thus, there's a very high barrier to entry, and it's difficult for people to innovate. I think it's one of the classic spaces where it's been very difficult to innovate. I think what Bitcoin does that's very interesting is it flips all that on its head by saying if you can develop good software on top of it, then you have a good chance of building a good business. So at the very fundamental level, sending or receiving Bitcoin costs less than a cent. And this is why you might hear people talk about, oh, this could be huge for micropayments. In other words, sending very small amounts of money over the internet, for example, where huge cost efficiencies can be achieved. The other kind of mind-blowing concept, we've seen this proliferation of the $35 Android phone, for example, in developing economies. Fundamentally, Bitcoin, again, is just software, so the cost of opening a bank account is zero. You're downloading software onto, let's say, a mobile phone. Similarly, sending money overseas, it's absolutely absurd to me that there are traditional remittance companies that will charge you $5 to send $50 of value to somebody in another country. In a modern internet age, there's no reason that that kind of value transfer should be so expensive. So those are a couple of different examples, and frankly speaking, again, this is why there are many implications of a protocol level innovation like this, but you've effectively taken a large closed financial system of transactions, made it open, and reduced the cost to moving some data around just like the internet. So much, much more efficient.
And that would account for why stock exchanges and banks are taking notice and investing in your company and others. Yes, sir.
Can you talk a little bit about the perspective of ordinary users? So you mentioned with transferring internationally, it's very cheap within Bitcoin, but you still need to convert to a conventional currency on the other end, which is going to, I think, end up adding significant cost. So is that the sort of, if you had to list like the 2 or 3 applications you think ordinary consumers who are not like Bitcoin enthusiasts are likely to use? They'll be actually practical. Do you see those now, or what do you see coming down the pike, and how long do you think it'll take before like normal people are using this kind of technology?
Sure. So I do think remittance will be a large one. To your point, you do have some kind of currency conversion costs, but if you look at developed foreign exchange markets, those costs are on the order of basis points, not full percents. I think the second thing, which is a little bit more abstract and difficult to predict, will be that it will make the internet in general a better experience. One of the very strange things about how the internet evolved is that there were no economics fundamentally embedded in the internet. And this is why you have things like banner advertisements all over websites, you have spam email. It's because there's really, in the case of banner ads, there's no good way to monetize the millions of people that might hit a news site. Or in the case of spam email, economically, you can send a bunch of spam email without really being punished for it. So imagine an internet where you actually can have economics that dictate all these behaviors, and you almost get to a version of a premium internet, if you will. I'm sure most people in this room would pay, let's say, $3, $5 a month to avoid all of that garbage on the internet and just really get to what you want. That would be another major area that I would look to. The final one is what I mentioned before around the underbanked, especially people in the developing world, where it's very difficult for a lot of these people to open a bank account. And we've seen this huge trend, right, of smartphones basically leapfrogging into close to 100% penetration in a lot of these countries, while bank accounts really are lagging behind to far lower than 50% of the country, sometimes 10 to 30%. I think it's actually quite possible that a lot of people have their first bank account in a purely digital format through something in digital currency and in Bitcoin.
Way in the back.
Hi, my question is actually for Chairman Goodlatte. I guess I'm concerned that you're moderating this conversation of a technology that in some fashion will appear before your committee is maybe a conflict of interest and gives the appearance of blessing the technology.
Well, I certainly think that it's very important that the technology be allowed to grow. This is not something that affects any one business alone or any one person. It's something that has developed from the grassroots, and it's important that Congress needs to learn about it and understand it, and so we certainly intend to do that, and this is one way to do that, but it's also important that as issues arise related to the technology, Congress holds hearings on those issues and so on, but it certainly does not in any way differ from any other sector of the economy that I take a keen interest in, from rooting for the Boston Red Sox, even though the Judiciary Committee has jurisdiction over our antitrust laws, including the baseball antitrust exemption. So we're happy to entertain a wide array of different new technologies in the Congress and here at State of the Net. My particular interests does not necessarily reflect what the interests of the Congress will be if and when it needs to act on any particular issue.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think that's it.
Well, let me just close by saying that this is, I think, an important new technology that people need to be paying attention to. There are a great many companies. Coinbase is a leader in this industry, but there are many companies that are already in existence that are deploying the use of Bitcoins, and many companies that are providing Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies as well, not just Bitcoin, that we here in Washington need to be taking notice of, and certainly folks in the tech sector need to be learning more about and figuring out how it's going to affect their business.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.